episode 128 of Silver Lining for Learning. And I'm so excited today, both by the topic and by our guest expert. The topic of artificial intelligence is very much present in discussions all around the world with an equal combination of unrealistic hope and unrealistic terror. So it's a great chance to talk about it. And I'm very pleased that Charles Fadel is joining us. Charles knows, because he's lived through many hype cycles for AI, as I have, that there's an instant crop of experts that spring up when a hype cycle starts. And they disappear again the minute the hype cycle is over, because they're now experts on whatever the new shiny, bright object is. But Charles has continued a deep interest in and application of ideas about AI, regardless of where the hype cycles are. And I've learned a lot from him, and look forward to learning more during this conversation, not just about AI, but about a curriculum and instruction and assessment given the challenges of the 21st century. Charles, I also think, holds the title now for having the most patents of any of the experts that we brought on to the show. He holds 7 more than I have. Coincidentally, that's 7. So without further ado, Charles, help us with your, how do you frame the issue of how we get the full benefit of AI in education?
It's an enormous question, but let's start one step at a time with AI itself, with or without education. As you mentioned so eloquently, Chris, we've been through many hype cycles. And when you realize that we've had fears and hopes back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, hiatus here and there, back again, and we're seeing yet again because of GPT-3 and DALL-E and some of the foundation models that are coming out, we have the same refrain all over again, which makes me think, and that was what I was scribbling earlier, to this Pink Floyd "Wish You Were Here" song that says, "Running over the same old ground, what have we found? The same old fears." It's just never ending. Now, of course, there is progress. When you think about Eliza in the 70s, that was just mimicking answers. That was just pathetic. Compared to GPT-3, yes, there has been real progress. And however, the progress comes from mainly 2 things. First of all, computational power. 70% of the progress has come from computational power, which is literally 1 million to 10 million times higher than we had in the 70s. Then 20% comes from the fact we have enormous databases. Databases is related also to Moore's law, because now we can afford to have giant databases full of memory chips and disk drives and so on. And only 10% comes from improved algorithms. So it says that, you know, all the algorithms you hear about backpropagation and so on and so forth, by and large, date back to the 80s, before the AI winter that Marvin Minsky provoked by dissing neural networks. Of course, at the time, you can only compute 3 layers with 3 layers of neurons, artificial neurons, and so there was pretty much nothing you could do much. And that's why eventually you saw the first Apple, well, the Newton, which everyone has conveniently forgotten, that had terrible handwriting recognition that was made fun of as cartoons. But you fast forward to now with all of this extra computational power, and yes, there are problems that are being cracked one at a time. Speech recognition now bests humans. Okay, obviously you've read about chess and Go, and you know. By the way, chess was conquered without AI, right? So Go has gotten AI. So undeniably there is progress. And so now you start thinking, okay, but what is the common denominator between all of these things and the difference between them and the hype? you realize that the common denominator is really about bounded versus unbounded problem. That's what we call in engineering bounded problems. So you have clear rules, even if the space of permutations is gigantic, like in Go, 10 to the 100th power or whatever, it's still a bounded problem. You have clear rules within a finite space. Those you can crack with AI, even when it comes to something as cool as folding proteins. It's still a bounded problem. So it doesn't say that it doesn't have enormous value. Obviously, what DeepMind has done with protein folding is it just accelerated us by light years. It's still a bounded problem. And so when people extrapolate from these bounded problems to saying, and therefore generalized intelligence is right around the corner and we are doomed, that's in a giant exaggeration that a lot of people go into. So I'll stop here and continue as you wish.
Charles, I was just wondering, we typically type in if you have a question, but you ended, so I was expecting more, but since you're not willing to say more, I'm going to ask you. So this is, there seems to be generational issues with regard to anything new. With technology, like you mentioned Newton. I remember having one of those to play with. I remember many years ago, I was very caught up with technology. Now I don't know, on my phone, I have way fewer apps than most people. I'm not even on most social media. I think I'm thinking about quitting Twitter. By the way, I want to really tell you, I think I'm going to quit Twitter. So yes. That's the only social media that I have. So the question really has to do with this, because as we get old, we've gone through multiple cycles of excitement. Then we lose enthusiasm for that interest. Then we have younger generations of people coming up, and they see this, and they, of course, did not experience what we had. That kind of positivism or enthusiasm should be endorsed. We want them to be as stupid as possible so they can keep doing what we used to do. So I was actually really wondering for any advice, any wisdom they want to share with people, especially the young ones who are just diving into this. On the one hand, keep being positive. There's something new possibilities will come out. Eventually they will get disappointed. Like we look at technology since 1990s. We've invested really billions in education technology. I can say technology has almost done nothing really in education. If you look at the grades, look at test scores, really it hasn't really changed a thing. If we did not invest, schools might have been closed because they are shown to be backwards. But at the same time, we haven't really made genuine progress. So I was wondering what kind of advice you might give in a nice way, a wise way to look at innovations without being overpowered by the innovativeness, but at the same time, keep a certain kind of confidence in new things could happen, and what can we do?
So I think as we all age, we start realizing that we need to keep a better dynamic equilibrium in our thoughts, meaning don't go too far in either direction. So we just oscillate over the tip of an N curve, but don't go too far. That's, I think, what wisdom ends up being, rediscovering this notion that from Confucius to Socrates, philosophers have talked about, everything in moderation, including moderation itself. That sort of wisdom. So it is okay, of course, to have naivete. I will not call it stupidity, but naivete of youth, to go against the fortress, because eventually, we have all these bodies that hit the wall. Eventually, someone will go through. Now, of course, that person will think that they're utterly brilliant, right? But they will not accept that they have actually, I'm mixing metaphors, but they've been literally riding on the shoulders of giants. And it's all the others that have eroded the wall ahead of them that allow them to go through. It's human nature, whatever. But the flip problem for us who've been through these cycles is to also perhaps dismiss them too easily. And so that's why the balance, right? So we have to acknowledge, wow, real progress. But no, it's still not going to be, generalized artificial intelligence. Give me a break. I think what we realize as we go through these cycles is that there are plenty of second, third order issues that we don't understand up front. And so the naivety up front says, of course, they can, if they can read this text, therefore they're, I don't know, intelligent or sentient, you know. But that's not true. All they can do is read a text with no further information. That's all they can do. And so once you start thinking about human intelligence and particularly human tasks, you know, jobs, etc., you realize that the task is not just I drive my car, you know, along a highway for 1,000 kilometers straight. It's much more complicated. You know, I'm driving at the Place de l'Étoile in Paris at rush hour. Good luck. You know, so that's what real life is. It's not just this monotask that goes on. So if your job happens to be a very single narrow task, sure, you get bumped. But how many jobs are just one narrow monotask? And that's one observation. The second one is there has been plenty of technologies having nothing to do with AI, like, for example, spreadsheets. Do we have as many bookkeepers entering, you know, numbers by hand and adding all of that by hand? No, but they have moved on to using spreadsheets to become better. And so this is a conversation I've had many times with Chris, and I know we're completely in sync on this, is how are we going to augment our intelligence? How are they going to be our companions doing these deep tasks that we can't do? We don't have that computational power to figure out, you know, a million proteins folding patterns. But once that's done, well, how are we going to use that protein to, I don't know, cure something? And so that's the model that we have to keep in mind and stop the fear aspect. Sure, some people here and there are going to be whacked, but at the same time, there are going to be new jobs emerging. And sometimes those new jobs are not necessarily higher in complexity. They may be higher or they may be higher in different complexity. For instance, when YouTube starts, you know, you think, wow, what's that mechanism? And then you realize, wow, there are people who are influencers. That's a real job? Well, yeah, it is. And no one could have thought of that as being a real job, well, 2 decades ago now. So there are all these displacement issues, but there's augmentation issues, and there's new things that pop up. And we're really bad as societies at thinking about the augmentations and the new things that pop up, where, of course, it's easier to be fearful and, you know, look at the downside of these things. And there is sometimes downside. It's just not as generalized as we fear.
So
and
thanks,
I'll finish with one more quote, if you allow me.
Go ahead.
Yuval Harari, you know, the author of Sapiens and so on, he said, I'm much more afraid of natural stupidity than I am of artificial intelligence.
That's a smart way to say that. I like that. So thanks, Charles, because I want to invite Chris, because Chris, you are today kind of a guest because you are part of a big National Science Foundation center around AI. I was wondering, what's your perspective? You know, how would you advise people like us to treat artificial intelligence right now?
Well, I'll answer in a way that I think Charles is in sync with, because we've had many conversations about this. People are paying attention to the wrong thing. And of course, this is standard also in how human beings approach technology. So they're saying, well, how can AI help me lecture better? You know, how can AI grade these psychometrically valid tests faster? And what they're not talking about is, why are we preparing people to lose to AI doing the things that AI does best, and not preparing people more deeply in what AI can't do, which is now our part of the partnership. And Charles is one of many experts on AI, but Charles, I think, is relatively unique in systematically and deeply rethinking curriculum, rethinking assessment about the goals of education and the kinds of outcomes that we need. And that's the elephant in the room, I think, with AI. Kurt, did you have?
Well, we also have two questions from Gerald. I don't know if Punya want to jump in with Gerald's questions, then I'll go after you, Punya.
Go ahead, Chris, you can ask.
Oh, okay. So, I normally ask questions at the end of the show or near the end of the show about practical things that might help graduate students out who are listening to the show or watching it later on, or our listening audience over in YouTube. But I'll jump in with it now. In the 80s, I was studying AI as much as I could, working in a company that made the most dense circuit boards in the world, and a company called Automated Systems, Inc. We designed, fabricated, leased our software, but we didn't change with the times. We were true blue mainframe all the way, and they went out of business shortly after I went to grad school. And I read the American Association of Artificial Intelligence every month when it came out, Canadian Information Processing Society. I thought I was going to study AI. And so I invested in those companies like Symbolics and Cognitive Systems, all those that spun out of MIT. And all the money my mom had invested in some life insurance plan, I took it. It was all the money I had saved for grad school. And that company did unethical things and quickly went out of business. And I lost all the money I had for grad school. And so I was what you would call naive, I guess, earlier. I sucked into the hype. I'm a slacker, a slough, and a surfer dude. And many of the people who are going to listen to our show later really are kind of falling into the hype or have fallen into the hype. And I would like for you to provide some guides, some ideas about what they might best study in terms of AI and AI in education in particular. What would be areas in which they could take a micro credential or some kind of nano degree in AI, and they'll never approach, most of them will never approach the knowledge that you have and the impact you've made, but how can they move on and make intelligent decisions later on about AI in education? What kinds of areas should they be reading about, exploring, and going to conferences and so forth? What would you advise them so they don't be fall into the hype like I did and lose all their money and so forth?
There are two aspects to that question. The first one relates more to what Young was mentioning earlier, which is EdTech at large. And so the first thing I would recommend is that those students who want to understand AI in education need to understand education technology first and foremost at large. Because there are plenty of things that not necessarily require intelligent adaptiveness. For example, you can come up with software, and plenty of companies do, that presents to you a question in 3 or 4 different formats until you get it. It doesn't require any AI, it just requires a certain form of adaptiveness. And that can work. That could be plenty sufficient. And on a Pareto chart, that might be 90% of the effect. Now, you can go through a lot more complexity and try to have the system learn your thinking patterns to present to you the best way possible. Oh, that's really, really, really complicated.
Yeah.
So my view is that first of all, they would need to understand education technology, technology, understand technology, take basic courses in technology, understand what the man-made world is, technologically speaking. Then take courses on education technology like Chris taught for so many years, and then try to figure out, okay, well, what can AI do in that context? And that's the hard part. Try to avoid getting sucked into the hype. And that's really the hard part, because you can, as Chris was saying, you can literally start with the wrong question. Why would I teach someone to learn, let's say, trigonometric functions a lot better using all of this technology, where we should be asking ourselves, why would anybody learn trig functions nowadays? There are plenty of other things you need to learn. So number one, that's the standards and curriculum. So that's the what, rethinking the what carefully. Then we have to rethink the how carefully. How can education technology help explicitly in the classroom? So there we know that the success has been narrow and hasn't generally propagated for reasons other than technology, adoption cycles, all sorts of things like that. So, so that's, I'm here. I'm perhaps trying to be, like I said, education technology has had successes. It's just that they've never scaled because there was never a mechanism to scale. And that's, I think, endemic to a lot of research in education. It's not just education technology. So a lot of research in education doesn't scale very well because the experiments are very, very narrow, RCT based or whatever, and there's never enough marketing money, call it literally marketing money, to propagate these innovations. There's never enough money to make them in a cohesive ensemble. So you have a billion experiments, super narrow, but there's no synthesis of them all in a format that the teacher can understand and say, okay, now this is what I can do in my classroom. So a lot of the research done by three-letter agencies and others ends up being very narrow, very specific, and not followed through by more than a paper, rather than synthesis and curriculum for teachers, et cetera, et cetera. So you see they're widening this answer to much, much more than AI. AI just happens to be the most, let's say, attractive counterexample nowadays.
Well, and if I could add to that, when you do think about AI, think about it creatively. So, everybody's saying go out and learn Python. If you want to understand AI, you got to start by learning Python. I would say go out and learn social perspective taking. Social perspective taking is part of social psychology. It draws on things like empathy, very useful in things like negotiation. And the point is that you learn how to take a perspective that isn't yours. And in AI, there's a challenge that our institute is wrestling with, this National AI Institute on Adult Learning and Online Education, called mutual theory of mind. What does the human being understand about what the AI partner can and can't do? And even more interesting, what does the AI partner understand about what the human being can and can't do? I think coming in with that kind of a lens will get you a lot further than being one of 100,000 people busy learning Python so that they can, do technical programming that probably AI will be doing within 3 or 4 years.
Well, truth be told, my languages are very dated. I learned Fortran and Lisp. Do I even remember how to code? Probably not. But do I need to? No. There are, of course, some specialists that are needed for coding. But when it comes to understanding implications of the technology, it's much better to have a broader synthetic view of what the technology is capable of doing rather than being completely lost in the weeds of the coding line. That's not where the action is. So again, learn about AI, don't learn AI. That's really what it boils down to from a student, particularly in education.
Right. So I appreciate both answers. When I got to grad school in '86 at Wisconsin, I went over to the psych department thinking about a double major in AI. All the students there were taking 10 to 12 years to finish. I said, I ain't doing that. So I double major in human development along with human learning. I studied social cognition and perspective taking as part of it. One of my main interest areas. So Chris, I appreciate that comment as well. Punya is going to jump in here, I think, now.
Sure, thank you. So Charles, I loved what you talked about, that nothing really significant in terms of, you look at sort of technologies for AI have really come about, since, what has changed is the computation power, the large databases that we have, and there has been some improvement in the algorithms, right? So I really appreciate that, because if you think about the dream of AI, which was like early on, that it would replicate sort of the human mind, to me, that this is really artificial intelligence. It's a different kind of intelligence than sort of humans have, which is why sort of the augmentation piece makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I do think there has been one change, and I again also appreciate this third and fourth order effect piece that you mentioned. So this is more of a comment, and I have a question after that. One thing that has changed, I think, is the level of access that people have to some of these tools now. So there was a time when these GPT-3 models would have been accessible to somebody in Stanford, somebody in MIT, and maybe one other place, right? But now you see that you have all these companies which are layering on GPT-3 tools. You're looking at generative AI, whether it's Midjourney or whatever, which now a kid sitting in India can access and play with. So I think that changes, that has sort of third and fourth order effects, which I think are impossible to predict now. Just as I couldn't have predicted the rise of, I still don't fully understand the rise of this idea of the influencer, right? I mean, but there are people who they're making a living doing that, and good living, right? So there are going to be these careers, these jobs that emerge, which are going to be the intersection. And I think that it's the growth of that audience is going to be a big factor in that as well. So that was just sort of as a comment, sort of building on what you were saying. Yeah. But I would like to go back to something that Chris had mentioned, I think you had sort of alluded to, that, and specifically towards what you think are the key roles that AI can play in education, right? So Chris sort of was sort of critical of AI that can use to grade, tests, right? But what would be some things that we should be thinking about as we look at the role of AI in education? And Chris, again, feel free to jump into this as well.
Chris, do you want to start, or?
You start as the guest, and then I'll jump in.
Okay, so all right, so let's talk about let's say intelligent tutoring systems. Oh, by the way, am I allowed to do a plug for the book that I wrote, I co-wrote, because a lot of the things I'm talking about here should be read. We're trying to be really balanced in the book. It's simply called Artificial Intelligence in Education. It is available on the Center for Curriculum Redesign website, and it will explain a lot of these middle-of-the-road mindsets that we've been talking about. So artificial intelligence in education. So regarding the uses, of course, everyone is looking for the nirvana of intelligent tutoring systems, right? But for every nirvana, there's a bunch of narrower applications. For example, automated essay grading, or as a minimum, automatic essay correction of grammar, right? So sure, that narrow, again, that's back to a bounded problem, that sort of narrow application might have quite a bit of merit. Why burden the teacher, correcting grammar if the system can do that, and then let the teacher think about the higher order semantics that are part of the paragraph. So a lot of narrow apps like this, Duolingo, figuring out how to teach you a foreign language better based on your patterns. Yeah. That's all that is great, but it's not an intelligent tutoring system. It doesn't replace a teacher or professor, which is where the hype resides. So that's from a teaching and learning aspect. Now, from an assessment aspect, it's really more about the analytics. AI is going to be helping us enormously with analytics once we have large databases of students' results that are, about more than just knowledge and grades of knowledge. And then we can start looking at all sorts of patterns between these results and say, is my student doing well in history class, but not so much in math class? But look, over time, he's always done well in math class. Why this year, etc. So we can find patterns out of large databases, and that is going to be really, really useful. Furthermore, and this is perhaps pushing it into a bit more science fiction-y, but I think it's going to happen, is what we call digital twins, where you can start looking at the students' patterns and try to predict what's going to happen and try an intervention with a digital twin of your student and say, well, let's see if I do this, what might be their reaction? So that's really pushing it. Again, let's be clear that this is borderline hype, but this is certainly from a research perspective, that's a really interesting avenue to explore above and beyond assessment. That's just pushing assessment to the next level of basically simulation, human simulation.
And if I can build on that, I have mentioned in the past on this program that I'm a consultant to a company called Mersion that does digital puppeteering, where a single simulation specialist can go well beyond the Wizard of Oz to play 5 or 6 or 7 virtual people simultaneously. And AI helps to make that possible at the front end and at the back end. So at the front end, to make these virtual people realistic, the avatar has to have a number of things programmed into it, because the simulation specialist can't, completely transform how they're portraying one person to another. And so the AI is doing a lot of the simulation. And in fact, the goal that the company and many others are working towards is to get to the point that the AI can do all the nonverbals. So if I'm the simulation specialist and there's a point in the meeting where my avatar is getting angry, I can raise the volume of my voice, I can raise the pitch of my voice, send positive signals about anger, use words that are associated with anger. And see, as people, our bodies automatically do the nonverbals when we do that. We don't even think about that. But an AI avatar, you have to have the AI able to recognize this and say, oh, I'm going to do the nonverbals. I'm going to lean forward and I'm going to put a scowl on my face and I'm going to do X and Y. That really makes this whole idea of digital puppeteering much more authentic and powerful. And then on the back end, through the webcam, you're collecting all this stuff about people. Most people don't realize just how much there is being collected. And so the machine learning system may say to the simulation specialist after 5 minutes, when this person pauses for more than a second and their eyes look left, they're bluffing. They sort of don't know what they're talking about, but they're trying to make it sound as if they do. Well, from an educational point of view, that's valuable because, we're all familiar with trying to cover up our ignorance when we should be admitting it and getting some help in learning it. So I think that there's new kinds, if we change the method of teaching to learning by doing, there's whole frontiers that open up for AI that make modes of learning by doing possible that we've just never really had before.
Thank you, Charles. Chris. So I saw a tweet recently from a teacher who said, why am I spending time grading student essays if they're going to be using AI to write those essays? I might as well have an AI grade the essays. So the point being, you will have AI writing the essays and AI is grading them and nobody learning anything in between. So I think you raise a good point, Chris, that we really need to start thinking, because I've been doing some experiments with these free tools that are out there, giving them certain prompts and asking them to write essays on different topics. And they're getting a B minus, on a lucky day, a B plus paper, right? And so I think that at the university level in particular, where this sort of 5-paragraph essay structure has become so ingrained, that we need to start thinking of new ways of doing that, because some of our questions are so stock, right? These essay prompts are so stock that these AI systems are actually going to do that much better than, are going to do it at a decent enough level that students would be okay with it. So Charles, you have a comment.
Well, but that goes back to what Chris commented on earlier. Why an essay to begin with? Who in the world communicates with essays nowadays? I'm not saying that everything should be 140 characters, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a long essay. A lot of people don't have the time, the inclination, the patience, the whatever to read a long essay or a long paper for that matter. Even academic, certainly academic papers. And so let's admit, how many of us just read the abstract, and only if this makes sense will we go further. But that's how most of us are. We are constantly making decisions about our time. So teaching students to communicate only via the most comprehensive yet time-hungry methods is just not appropriate nowadays. You should be figuring out how do you give your message in as short but as impactful way as possible.
And building on what Charles is saying, any good reporter will tell you that when you have a description, that's the start of the journey. That's not the end of the journey. You relate the description to larger contexts of things that are happening. You create a narrative where there's a story behind the description, because human beings are wired for stories and so on. And that's what we should be doing with students. We should be starting with the descriptive essay and saying, okay, here's the essay. Guess what? The AI can't relate this to the larger context. The AI can't write a narrative because it doesn't understand people. So here's your chance. And it's just unfortunate that that people are buying into this idea that because AI can help to write an article in the Stanford School of Education magazine that's a description of AI writing, that it's going to start writing Moby Dick tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
Well, that's probably true, Chris. Get ready to read that. But anyway, so I think but my question is really related to what Charles was talking about. Teach, learn about AI, not learn AI. That is definitely the advice. But my question is broader than that, because we apparently have entered a world that's dominated by technology, social media, government control. I'm thinking about China's, COVID lockdown with cell phones, with big data. It's unbelievable. It is unbelievable. But our schools don't teach kids anything about this kind of controlling the true impact of technology being doing evil or doing good. And Charles, because I know you've been working a lot on curriculum, we've also been arguing about digital competence. For a long time we should learn digital competence, and there's also words called computational thinking. All this new nonsense, I call them, and a lot of this. So if you were designing a course that all our students really need to understand how social media can be completely manipulating, for example, and how meta may not be so meta, all this, how AI may be used to control people, how big data can really drive your loss of privacy. I don't know how much privacy we still have, but I don't think we have much. So what kind of content would you suggest our K-12 schools do? You might not suggest anything, but go ahead.
So there are at least two avenues I can think of right off the bat. One, which is when we talk about STEM, as in science, technology, engineering, math, it's really math and science, right? The T and E is a joke. Certainly there's no E, and the T is basically digital literacy. So you don't necessarily have anything that talks about implications of technology. So you can imagine, for example, that your sociology course, your philosophy course, even English courses would talk about the implications of technology. That should be a very easy thing to bring up in those courses. Then there's information literacy at large, being barraged with junk everywhere. Well, that requires a lot more information literacy. And unfortunately, I think that the problem is more for adults than it is for younger students. I think younger students understand that it's a messy world out there. It's people the age of our parents that are propagating a lot of misinformation because they're used to a world where you had only 1 or 3 TV channels and they spewed the truth. So when they see anything, they don't have the mind habits of saying, wait a second, this makes no sense. basically they confuse the possible with the probable. Okay, this confusion between the possible and the probable is misunderstanding probabilities, which is one of my pet peeves. If there's one course in math that should be really taught very well with the psychology department involved, it should be probabilities. So, because it's at the root of information illiteracy, etc. So yes, there are things one can do, but I wouldn't necessarily do them as a standalone, and here's a course on whatever, history of technology, where's technology going. It really should be embedded everywhere in a very natural way. The problem is that the disciplines themselves don't view themselves in that large sort of way. That's why we talk about interdisciplinarity, but nothing happens because we don't equip the teachers with, well, if we're serious about probabilities, you can cover it from a math perspective in a week. But if you really want to talk about decision-making, human perceptions, etc., it should take a month. And of course, the math teacher is going to say, well, first of all, I don't have an extra 3 weeks. Second, I'm not a psychologist. Third, why me? And so that's really what should happen. It's not just, well, okay, let's have both teachers do a session together. It's more than that. It's really rethinking what we can equip teachers to do.
Charles, I just want to follow up with that. I really want to bring Chris into this one too, because when I see the dictatorial systems, companies, countries, they try to use technology to potentially, do crazy things. It will have a lot of sci-fi movies about this. As a country that embraces democracy, I don't know how US is still doing that, should there be somehow a way to reach our children to say you can stand up to certain things? Like I was just talking about quitting Twitter, for example, and Twitter might quit itself, before I quit it, but that's a different story. So what kind of things we can do to get our children to really raise their awareness to say, let's not be controlled by this, but what actions could we take? Chris, you feel free jumping in. I'm just pulling it. I'm just really playing with this.
Yeah. I love, Charles, I love what you said, and just sort of struck a thought in my mind. So that's why I'm jumping in here. Seems to me that there is a curriculum here that really needs to be a part of every K-12 curriculum, is this intersection of understanding, like a deep understanding of probabilistic thinking, and the work like by Kahneman and Tversky on our sort of cognitive biases, which to me, like really, I mean, and again, these biases are so strong that even like, Kahneman and Tversky talk about the fact that even in their own experiments, they would sometimes fall for it, right? So it really requires a deep understanding of how we fall for these tricks. So again, it goes back to this point. It's not about the technology. It is about how we think about it. So I just wanted to make that point. Thank you for that thought.
That's why, Punya, what we're recommending is that we do make room for, yes, technology and engineering being taught explicitly. So branches of engineering, not just AI and computer science, technology, as we were just discussing, but also psychology, sociology, and anthropology being taught explicitly, even in high school, for everybody, not as an elective. Third, entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is the job of the future. Why not teach it? But to teach these 3 new disciplines, you have to make room because the old ones have sucked up all the time. And of course, getting them to pare down what they're doing, for example, no trigonometric functions, so we can teach more entrepreneurship, that's not going to happen too easily. And that's the problem we're all facing, is that these choices are made in a way that is so immobile, so mammoth-like, that it's really hard to embed new things and give them the time of the day. So for example, we try to shove computer science into math, we try to shove financial literacy into math, rather than say, just if these things are important, make room for them.
I guess my quick answer would be, we need to teach students that you shouldn't let other people do your thinking for you. You shouldn't listen to anybody that says, this is too hard for you to understand, but I understand it. Just do what I'm telling you to do and you'll be fine. That is in part a product of an educational system that says to most students, you're not very smart. You're not in the top third of the bell curve. So you should just really let smart people tell you what to do. People who went to Harvard, for example. And people need to never, ever let anybody else do their thinking for them, because a lot of the problem with authoritarianism and fascism and the way that we see the world going is people say, well, I'm really kind of lost here, so I'm going to let so-and-so do my thinking for me. Bad idea.
Absolutely. So you're evoking two comments here. The first one is that our minds are lazy by good evolutionary design. So if we can put it on hold and let someone else do the thinking, we will, just because that's how we're wired. It's evolution wires us this way, because otherwise the 20% of our brains represent 20% of the energy consumption of our body for 5% of the body mass. So it's an inefficient organ when you think about it in energy efficiency. And so we are wired by evolution to put it on hold as often as we can. Please don't ask me to think. That's eating up my food. Okay. So the problem with that, of course, is, as Chris was saying, it creates terrible issues. And so the other aspect that comes into this is, there's a societal generational aspect. I would say my generation was a lot more rebellious. I don't think we had a great relationship with our parents, but I think the new generations have a far better relationship with their parents. Too good, in my opinion, because they're not used to rebelling. They're not used to think for themselves. Mommy and daddy have helicoptered for me. They have snowblowed the problems in front of me. I'm fine. There's no reason why I would rebel. There's no reason why I would be leery of being tracked at all time. Look, they offered me a cell phone when I was 5, and they know at any moment of the day where I am. So what if the government does that? Isn't that normal? So I think there's this societal generational aspect of, we have normalized, in our efforts to be good parents, we have removed the natural, teenage rebellion, and we have also normalized being tracked at all times. And so it's relatively easy for, even in democracies, to be tracked at all times.
So Charles, I'm wearing my slacker shirt, as you know.
Yep.
I'm a bit naive. And so I'm going to ask first a naive question of you, a very quick one, and then I have I think a better question to ask both of you. Given you're one of the first guests, if not the first guest, who's got 7 patents, I want, just as an aside for everyone who's listening to the show later on or on the jogging trails, is it like Facebook, the movie, when someone gets a patent, it's all vicious fighting, or is it just like a new book comes out, you got a new patent? Is it just you yawn when a new patent? I mean, is it really competitive out there in this world, and people are, can you briefly describe the process, and maybe tell us about what one of those patents was?
Okay. So to demystify patents, the one thing that people don't realize is that you don't have to reduce to practice your idea. In other words, you don't have to build it to prove that it can work. Shocking, perhaps, but that's how it is. I don't know that it always used to be that way, but basically you can invent something and not make it. So number one. Number two, there's a difference in innovation between radical innovation and incremental innovation. An enormous amount of patents are merely incremental, including many of mine, where it's just a question of improving on video conferencing, for instance. So it's not a question of a massive idea. It's just an incremental idea, how you can make basically the pixels of our face look better, things of that nature. So there's a lot out there in terms of innovation that's incremental. And that's a second thing to demystify patents. Not everything is complicated to get. You can get patents the same way that you can write books. The trick is to come up with patents and books that are useful, that are read, that are, acted upon. And that's where it gets a bit more tricky. But there's, one that I'm particularly happy of, which is an anti-Facebook patent, where it allows you to decide who sees what information when and how much about you. It's literally the other way around. And that's perhaps less incremental. And the one that we have filed, which is not granted yet on, so that's number 8, it's about how do you assess student data in a multi-dimensional world. That would be really cool if we get it. So not everything has the same value, the same way that you can have a bestseller, you can have a book that doesn't get picked up by anyone but the author, right? And everything in between.
That's great.
I would just quickly add that I don't know that I could get 7 patents if I tried, but I'm not trying. And one reason is that the minute I got a patent, the Harvard lawyers would show up and say, "Thank you very much. We'll take it from here." So
well,
I ain't going to be starting any Facebooks. The institutions have figured that out now, and you're a wholly owned subsidiary of them.
But when I was at Cisco, the first 5 patents are owned by Cisco, and that was just part of being a brain for hire, which is what an employee is, right? So part of the contract was if you invent something, they own on their time, they own it, and that's fine by me. But the other 2 plus 1 are for my center, so it's on my own. It's different, but not every patent. I mean, I don't think that Facebook really is a patent, right, Kurt? So I think you're really more thinking about the PageRank algorithm.
Right.
Okay. And even I'm not even clear that they're the ones who came up with PageRank. They may have improved on something, whatever.
Yeah.
Now,
since
we're talking about AI here,
yeah.
One interesting aspect that my patent attorney, Robert Plotkin, has been looking at for more than a decade is, can AI invent? And what do we do in that case? So that's an interesting conversation. I'm doing a plug for him here. He wrote a book called The Genie in the Machine.
Right.
That was published 15 years ago, I think, way before all this became hot. And he's asking all the right questions with a lot of sobriety. And, I really enjoyed thinking about these issues.
So my other question for both of you, and given you mentioned Duolingo earlier, which is a tool I'm doing research on right now, and you also mentioned learning analytics, where AI can really make a difference and help. I'm wondering in the past couple of years, what either of you have seen as surprising, happy surprising, as well as disappointing. Is there anything struck you in the field of AI that shocked, surprised, and brought a pleasant smile to your face, something that really was disappointing, it got overhyped? Either one of you.
I think I've been very pleased to see GPT-3 and DALL-E. I've been happy to see that it's finally getting somewhere. But the biggest thing that I've been happy about, perhaps more geeky, is the protein folding prowess of DeepMind. I think the thing that has been shocking or surprising or disappointing is the fact that neuroscientists and computer scientists don't talk anywhere near enough to each other, or psychologists, let's say. That's why I enjoyed what Roger Schenck wrote back in, I think, the 80s or the 90s about how humans think versus how machines think. And because he had both capabilities in him, right? He was an AI guy and he was a psychologist. And so he came up with a list of tasks that an educated human should be able to do. So in my presentations, I look at these tasks, and the problem is you can say AI can do all of these, sort of. And that's where it gets really complicated, because every single one of these tasks, it depends. Have you presented the data in a format that the AI can understand? Is this, just, do we give it the rest of the context or not, etc. So all these human tasks are it depends for an AI. And that's where I would love to see a lot more research, which is, bringing together these two sides, knowledge representation networks, and let's say epistemology, and have serious conversations between those two sides.
Rodney Brooks of MIT wrote a wonderful article that I assign in my teaching on AI called The 7 Deadly Sins of AI Forecasting. And one of them is related to what Charles is saying, that it's one thing to be able to do something, it's another thing to be able to do it well. I remember on the internet when I learned that dogs could sing, and I was fascinated, and I went and listened to a bunch of dogs singing, and at first I was impressed, and then I realized they weren't singing very well. You're not going to have Handel's Messiah with a canine chorus anytime in the near future. So there's some of that problem with AI. In terms of prowess, natural language processing, there have been some interesting breakthroughs recently in NLP that involve a completely different approach coming out of AI. And it's not clear at this point what the strengths and limits are because it's so new, but people in NLP are really, really excited about what's happening.
Yep. So about NLP, Chris, for me, one of the interesting things would be how much can we query the systems or the GPT-3 systems to give us the sort of answers we're looking for. That's the tough part, getting the real answer for a non-trivial question.
Yeah, and so I recently wrote a blog post about that. So Chris, I'd shared it with all of you. I don't know, Charles, if Chris shared it with you, but one of the pieces there was this marketing person who was using GPT-3 to create these profiles. And there was this paper out of Brigham Young where, they were, and the sad part of it was how stereotypical that those profiles were, because they were being based on stereotypical data. And there was an episode of the Hard Fork podcast where they talked about that one could now start thinking about testing marketing campaigns on GPT-3 models of the population before actually putting them out. And this goes back, I think, to the point Zhao was making earlier about that, how these technologies can be used to sort of model and test propaganda campaigns in ways that people won't even know that they're being manipulated, which again comes full cycle back to our getting a better understanding of our cognitive biases so that we can sort of fight against it or at least resist it. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Charles.
Well, there's been techniques like this called neuromarketing that have existed for at least a decade or two. You go into some stores and you have this pleasant smell. That pleasant smell has been researched to know exactly why it would make you buy that T-shirt or whatever. So you have all sorts of manipulations like that out there, and that's why we would need to educate people about, well, at least know that they exist. You may still fall for them, but at least know that that's why you're buying the T-shirt. It's because they got you literally by the nose.
Perfect. Thank you.
So I have one final comment. I think this topic will never end because in AI right now and Meta, these two things are the two biggest topics in technology, and they get a lot of support and money. And I don't know how good it is but if you talk to school leaders, they are not into this field yet. So I don't think they are. I mean, I was just meeting with a lot of school principals, they're not in this field yet. So I don't know when companies will begin to sell AI-based products to schools. Chris and Charles, do you have any comments on that?
They already do. Dreambox sells mathematics courseware powered by AI, etc. You can't actually sell anything if you don't say on the box powered by AI. Because your VC, you would not have gotten the VC money if it was not told, powered by AI. So that's why there's also this enormous conflation of anything algorithmic, and calling it AI. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Well, as usual, our time has gone very quickly, and I just want to thank Charles. Charles certainly could have spent the hour talking deeply about the technical aspects of AI, and he's walked his talk in our discussion about the fact that the important thing is not to talk AI, it's to talk about AI and to understand it, if you will, from the outside within a larger context. So it's been a great show. Thank you, Charles, for contributing to it. And I urge that you look at the Center for Curriculum Reform that Charles leads, because it has a lot of creative work going on there. Punya, tell us about next week.
Chris, if
Thank
I may
you
just,
again, Charles.
I may just quick correction, Center for Curriculum Redesign.
Sorry.
No worries.
Redesign is better than reform.
Yes, and thank you, Charles, for joining us today. Next week, first of all, it's a new time. It'll be 11 a.m. Eastern, and this will be the second of our 3 episodes devoted to India. We had one a couple of weeks ago, and next week we will have Sandhya Gupta from Avishkar Foundation and Eshwar Bandi from Inqilab Foundation, who will be talking about student-centered learning in an Indian context. Really looking forward to it. I think the last episode we had on India was very exciting, and I think this one will be a great episode as well.